Welcome to this journey into one of the most disturbing cases ever recorded in the history of Missouri Ozarks. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. We're always curious to know what places and at what times of day or night these accounts find you. In the winter of 1912, the Springfield Republican newspaper printed a short notice about a family disturbance in Taney County, deep in the Ozark Mountains. The article, barely 3 paragraphs long, mentioned that local authorities have been called to investigate the disappearance of a woman named Eliza Whitlock, who had vanished from her isolated homestead near the White River. Her husband, Thomas Whitlock, claimed she had left voluntarily after a domestic disagreement. The article ended by saying no further investigation was considered necessary at the time. But what the newspaper failed to mention was that this tiny report would mark the beginning of one of the most unsettling cases in Ozark history, a case that would remain largely undocumented for decades. The Whitlock property sat on roughly 40 acres of rocky hillside near the small settlement of Walnut Shade, about 15 miles south of Forsyth, the Taney County seat. The homestead consisted of a 2-story timber frame house, a small barn, and several outbuildings. County records from 1908 show that Thomas purchased property after moving from Springfield, where he had worked as a clerk at Heer's department store. The records describe Thomas as a man of quiet disposition and precise habits. His wife, Eliza, formerly Eliza Crawford, had been a schoolteacher in Christian County before their marriage in 1905. The couple had 2 children, Edward, age 6 in 1912, and Mary, age 4. Neighbors later remembered the Whitlocks as a very private family who rarely took part in community events. Thomas would occasionally travel into Forsyth or Branson for supplies, but Eliza was rarely seen beyond the edge of their property after their first year living there. This isolation wasn't unusual for the Ozarks, where homesteads could be miles apart, separated by dense oak and pine forests, limestone bluffs, and steep hollows. The Ozarks had long been a place where people could disappear, from the law, from debts, or from society itself. According to Joseph Miller, whose family owned the neighboring property to the east, the Whitlocks seemed content enough during their first few years. Miller, interviewed decades later in 1952 by a Missouri Historical Society researcher, said that Thomas was very particular about his land boundaries and mostly kept himself, though he would nod a greeting when their paths crossed. Eliza was even more reserved, but the children appeared healthy and well cared for. Miller noted that in the fall of 1911, roughly 6 months before Eliza vanished, Thomas began making improvements to property. He dug what appeared to be a new root cellar behind the house and reinforced the doors with additional locks. The last confirmed sighting of Eliza by anyone outside the family came in November 1911. Harriet Bowman, a midwife from Walnut Shade, had been called to the homestead after receiving word that Eliza was unwell. In her statement to the Taney County Sheriff in April 1912, Bowman said that Eliza appeared pale and nervous, but showed no obvious signs of physical illness. She recalled that the house felt unusually cold despite the fireplace being lit, and that Thomas stayed in the room during her entire visit, answering most of the questions directed at his wife. When Bowman suggested that Eliza might benefit from seeing a doctor in Forsyth, Thomas reportedly replied that the family could not afford the expense and that his wife would recover with rest. County records also show that throughout the fall of 1911, Thomas made regular withdrawals from the family's modest savings account at the Taney County Bank. According to preserved bank ledgers, Thomas withdrew nearly half of their total savings between September and December that year. The bank manager, Harold Winters, later recalled that Thomas had explained the withdrawals as necessary for home improvements and winter preparations. Winters said that such expenses were common for homesteaders in the area, but the amount Thomas withdrew seemed unusually high for a family of their means. The winter of 1911 to 1912 was particularly severe in the Ozarks. Heavy snowfall in December and January isolated many remote homesteads for weeks, and it was common for families to go without any outside contact until spring. Weather records from the Springfield Weather Bureau show that temperatures in February 1912 dropped to near zero on multiple occasions, with several inches of snow remaining on the ground until mid-March. This isolation meant that unusual events could easily go unnoticed by neighbors for weeks at a time. It was during this long, harsh winter, sometime between late February and early March, that Eliza Whitlock supposedly left her family. The exact date of her disappearance was never firmly established. Thomas first mentioned his wife's absence to Joseph Miller in late March, when Miller met him on the road to Forsyth. According to Miller's 1952 account, Thomas simply said, "The missus has gone away," and offered no further explanation. Of his neighbors, Miller did not press for details, and the matter might have ended there. But other records tell a deeper story. Archival records from a general store in Forsyth show that Thomas Whitlock's purchasing habits changed noticeably in early March 1912. Store ledgers indicate that on March 4th, he bought an unusually large quantity of preserved foods, coffee, and lamp oil, enough to sustain a household for several weeks without needing another trip to town. The store owner, Jeremiah Collins, noted in his personal journal, discovered among his papers after his death in 1938, that Thomas seemed agitated and avoided his usual small talk. Collins wrote that when he asked about Mrs. Whitlock's health, Thomas replied curtly, "She is not my concern at present." The matter might have remained entirely private had it not been for the intervention of Eliza's sister, Catherine Crawford, who lived in Springfield and had not heard from Eliza since the previous autumn. According to correspondence preserved by the Taney County Historical Society, Catherine wrote to the postmaster at Walnut Shade in early April 1912, asking about her sister's welfare. When the postmaster informed her that Eliza had reportedly left her family, Catherine traveled to Taney County and personally requested that Sheriff James Harmon investigate the disappearance. Catherine's personal journal, later donated to Missouri State Archives by her granddaughter in 1961, offers a window into her thoughts at the time. In an entry dated April 10, 1912, she wrote, "I cannot believe that Eliza would leave her children willingly. Since her marriage to Thomas, her letters have become increasingly infrequent and guarded. But her devotion to Edward and Mary was clear in every word she wrote about them. Something is terribly wrong, and I fear what I might discover in Taney County." Sheriff Harmon's official report, dated April 18, 1912, documents his visit to the Whitlock homestead. He reported finding the property in good order, with Thomas and both children present. The children appeared adequately fed and clothed, though Harmon noted that both were unusually quiet during the visit. Thomas maintained that Eliza had left voluntarily after voicing her dissatisfaction with their isolated life. He claimed she took only a small valise with personal items and suggested she might have returned to Springfield, despite Catherine's insistence that no relatives had heard from her. Harmon inspected the house and reported finding no sign of disturbance or struggle. He noted that Eliza's clothing and personal effects were gone from the bedroom drawers, supporting Thomas's claim that she had packed before leaving. With no evidence of foul play, Harmon concluded that there was no crime to investigate. And, as an adult, Eliza had the right to leave her family if she wished. Catherine reluctantly accepted the official conclusion, and the case was closed. But Harmon's private papers, discovered after his death in 1931, tell a different story. In a personal notebook, he wrote, "Whitlock was too composed for a man recently abandoned. The children watched their father's face before answering any question, no matter how simple. The boy began to speak about his mother, but stopped abruptly when Thomas cleared his throat. Most troubling was the patch of freshly turned earth behind the house. Whitlock claimed it was for a new garden, but the timing was wrong, and the shape was more like a trench than a garden bed." Harmon's notes reveal that he harbored serious suspicions about Thomas Whitlock, but felt powerless to act. "Without a body or a witness, there is no crime to investigate," he wrote. Mrs. Crawford's concerns, while understandable, are not proof. In these hills, family matters are considered private, and the county lacks the resources for extended investigations on mere suspicion. This reluctance to intervene reflected the limited law enforcement capabilities and cultural attitudes of rural Missouri in the early 20th century. Catherine Crawford returned to Springfield after a meeting with the sheriff, but her fears never left her. Her journal records that she tried to maintain contact with her niece and nephew by sending letters and small gifts, but Thomas replied only with short, formal acknowledgments. In June 1912, Catherine made another trip to Taney County to visit the children, but Thomas refused to let her in, telling her that her presence was disruptive to the household routine. Catherine's final journal entry on the matter, dated July 3, 1912, reads, "I fear I have failed Eliza. Without proof or legal standing, I cannot force my way into Thomas's home or take the children. I can only pray that if Eliza is alive somewhere, she will find her way back to them, or at least to me." For several years, the disappearance of Eliza Whitlock remained a quiet, private matter, known only to family and a few locals. Thomas continued to run the homestead, raising Edward and Mary with occasional help from a local woman, Martha Jenkins, who began working at the property in the summer of 1912. Jenkins later told a neighbor that Thomas instructed her never to discuss Eliza with the children and to tell them, if they ever asked, that their mother would return when she was well. Decades later, Jenkins was interviewed briefly by Sheriff Masterson during the 1952 investigation. By then, she was an elderly woman living in a nursing home in Branson, but her memory of the summer of 1912 remained sharp. Jenkins recalled several unusual aspects of her time working in the Whitlock home. According to the transcript of her 1952 interview, preserved in the county archives, she stated that Thomas had strict rules about certain areas of the property that were never to be disturbed. He was particularly protective of the root cellar he had built. Once, when young Mary wandered too close to it, Thomas grabbed her so roughly that she cried out. He later apologized, saying that dangerous tools were stored there and that he only wanted to keep the children safe. Jenkins also reported that Thomas often suffered from insomnia and would pace the house through the night. More than once, she arrived in the morning to find him sitting at the kitchen table, clearly having not slept, muttering to himself about keeping watch and maintaining the barriers. Although she found his behavior disturbing, Jenkins attributed it to the strain of raising two children alone. Like many in the community, she hesitated to interfere in what she considered a private family matter. By 1913, Edward and Mary Whitlock were attending the one-room schoolhouse in Walnut Shade. Their teacher, Abigail Thornton, kept a diary in which she recorded her concerns about the children. She wrote that both were abnormally quiet and withdrawn, and that Edward, in particular, had long periods of silence that worried her. Thornton's diary describes an incident in October 1913 when a visiting woman at the school tried to ask Mary about her mother. Mary became visibly distressed, and that same afternoon, Thomas Whitlock arrived, removed both children from school, and kept them home for nearly 2 weeks. Thornton's diary, which remained in private hands until 1965, contains several other troubling entries. She noted that Edward often arrived with dark circles under his eyes, claiming that the noises kept him awake at night. When she asked what noises he meant, he refused to answer. Mary, though younger, seemed to adapt better to school life, but displayed what Thornton described as a strange preoccupation with burial. The teacher once discovered a series of drawings in Mary's desk depicting a figure lying underground, with flowers growing above. By the spring of 1914, Edward's condition had worsened. Thornton wrote that he began to have episodes in which he would sit motionless, staring at nothing. During one such episode, Edward whispered over and over, "She's still digging." Disturbed, Thornton tried to speak with Thomas about his son's condition. Her diary entry from April 12, 1914 reads, "Mr. Whitlock received my concerns with cold anger. He informed me that his son's education was his business and that my observations were unwelcome. I fear for these children, but what can I do? Mr. Whitlock has threatened to remove them from school permanently if I pursue the matter. The Whitlock family remained in Taney County until 1917, when Thomas suddenly sold the homestead and moved the children to Kansas City. County records show that the property was sold to James Harker, a cattle rancher from Arkansas, for significantly less than its assessed value. Harker later told neighbors that Thomas seemed eager to conclude the deal quickly and had accepted the very first offer. The timing of the sale coincided with growing scrutiny from local authorities. Records uncovered during the 1952 investigation show that in March 1917, Abigail Thornton had finally reported concerns about the Whitlock children to the county superintendent. The superintendent sent a formal letter requesting a meeting with Thomas to discuss their welfare. Post office records confirmed that the letter was delivered on April 3, 1917. Thomas listed the property for sale the very next day and had completed the transaction before the end of the month. James Harker made several modifications to the property after purchasing it, including tearing down what was left of the root cellar. In a 1952 statement, Harker's son, William, recalled that his father described the cellar as oddly deep for a food storage space and divided by interior walls. He said that his father had uncovered several curious items during demolition, including a woman's hairbrush with dark strands still tangled in the bristles, buried about 2 feet below the cellar floor. At the time, James Harker had thought little of it, assuming it was discarded household trash. The Harkers owned the property until 1933, when economic hardship forced them to sell during the Great Depression. The house passed through several owners over the next 2 decades, gradually falling into disrepair as new residents focused on other areas of the land. By 1950, the house stood mostly abandoned, occasionally used by local teenagers as a meeting spot. Whispers spread that the property was haunted, that on quiet nights, a woman's cries could be heard coming from somewhere in the dark. For years, the disappearance of Eliza Whitlock faded from memory, eclipsed by World War I, the influenza epidemic, and the steady march of time. It might have remained forgotten forever, if not for what happened in 1952. That year, the property, now overgrown and nearly reclaimed by the woods, was purchased by Walter and Ruth Simmons, a couple from St. Louis hoping to turn the land into a hunting lodge. On June 12, 1952, the Simmons reported to the Taney County Sheriff's Department that while clearing brush behind a decaying house, they had uncovered what appeared to be the collapsed entrance to an old root cellar. Upon closer inspection, they discovered something lodged between 2 of the limestone blocks that had once formed the cellar walls. A small leather-bound book. The book, badly damaged by moisture and time, was identified as the personal diary of Eliza Whitlock, with entries ranging from January 1910 to February 1912. Ruth Simmons, who first discovered it, later shared her impressions in an interview with the Springfield News Leader. The pages were stuck together, much of the ink had run, she recalled, but you could still make out the handwriting in places. What struck me most was how the writing changed over time, neat and controlled at first, then increasingly erratic, like someone writing in fear. The diary's discovery triggered a new investigation by Sheriff William Masterson. Despite the damage, many entries were still legible, and they painted a disturbing picture of Eliza Whitlock's final years. What began as simple accounts of rural life slowly shifted into expressions of dread over her husband's behavior. In one entry, dated August 14, 1911, Eliza wrote, "T watches constantly, says the house is not secure enough, speaks of dangers I cannot see. When I suggested visiting my sister, his face changed in a way I cannot describe." Another entry from October 3, 1911 read, "The children are forbidden to wander beyond the yard now. T has nailed shut the window in our bedroom, says it is to keep out the cold, but the first frost has not even come." By November 1911, when midwife Harriet Bowman visited the home, Eliza's tone grew desperate. "I wanted to speak freely but could not, with him standing there, listening to every word. When she left, T said no one else would be permitted to enter our house. He says they bring contamination from town." In December, she wrote of the new room beneath the house that Thomas was secretly building. He calls it sanctuary, but it feels more like a tomb. Perhaps most chilling was her January 8, 1912 entry. I found Edward this morning standing at the cellar door, staring. When I asked what he was doing, he said, "Father says we'll all sleep there soon when the time comes." When I questioned T about this, he became enraged, accusing me of turning the children against him. Her entries became fragmented after that. On January 23rd, she wrote, "The tonic he prepares each evening leaves me groggy and confused. I have begun pouring it into my potted plant instead. The plant died within days." Her final readable words, written on February 17th, 1912, were chilling. "He found these pages tonight. His rage was terrible. The children are locked in their room. I hear him digging again." Acting on the diary's contents, Sheriff Masterson ordered an excavation of the site where the root cellar once stood. On June 18th, 1952, investigators uncovered human remains, later identified through dental records as those of Eliza Whitlock. The medical examiner, Dr. Lawrence Wilson, concluded that she had suffered a fatal blow to the skull and had been buried face down in a shallow grave, her hands bound behind her back with wire. He also discovered traces of sedative in preserved tissue, supporting Eliza's claim that Thomas had been drugging her. Authorities attempted to locate Thomas Whitlock and his children, but records showed that Thomas had died in a Kansas City hospital in 1931 from pneumonia. Edward was killed in action during World War II in 1944. Only Mary Whitlock, now Mary Coleman, was still alive, living in Omaha, Nebraska, with her husband and children. City records revealed that Thomas had worked as a night watchman after leaving Tenney County and was remembered as a strict but quiet man. One neighbor, Estelle Parker, told investigators that Thomas became visibly upset whenever anyone asked about the children's mother. Mary married Richard Coleman in 1929, moving to Omaha soon after. On the marriage license, she listed her mother as deceased, despite no death certificate ever being issued, suggesting that either Thomas told her that Eliza had died or Mary chose to believe it on her own. When contacted by Missouri authorities in July 1952, Mary Coleman claimed she had no memory of the events surrounding her mother's disappearance. She said her father had always told her that Eliza had abandoned the family, and she had never questioned that story. Privately, however, Coleman's husband later reached out to investigators. He reported that Mary suffered from recurring nightmares about a woman calling from beneath the floorboards, and that she had always harbored an extreme fear of enclosed spaces. In a letter preserved in the case file, Richard Coleman wrote, "Mary has suffered from what doctors now call anxiety attacks throughout our marriage. These episodes are often triggered by certain sounds, especially digging or scraping, or by the sight of particular objects like gardening tools or root cellars. For years, she has refused to enter our basement or any underground space. When I ask about the origin of these fears, she becomes distant and changes the subject." Investigators also gathered testimony from former residents of Tenney County who had known the Whitlock family. Clara Jensen, who had been a young girl living near Walnut Shade in 1912, recalled that her father once saw Thomas Whitlock in the town of Forsyth purchasing an unusual quantity of quicklime from a hardware store. When asked about it, Thomas claimed it was for preserving the root cellar walls against moisture. Clara also remembered overhearing her parents discuss strange noises coming from the Whitlock property late at night that winter, sounds her father dismissed as either wild animals or the wind howling through the hollow. Her brother Harold provided a written statement describing an unsettling encounter with Edward Whitlock that spring. Harold said Edward appeared distressed and asked him if people could hear things through the ground. When Harold asked what he meant, Edward whispered, "Father says no one can hear anything to the ground once it's packed down tight, but I think I can still hear her sometimes." Before Harold could ask more, Thomas appeared and called Edward home. Harold mentioned the strange conversation to his parents, but they dismissed it as childish imagination. Further research into Thomas Whitlock's background revealed a potential explanation for his worsening paranoia before Eliza's disappearance. Records from the State Lunatic Asylum in Nevada, Missouri, now the Nevada State Hospital, showed that Thomas's father, William Whitlock, had been committed in 1890 after violent paranoid delusions. He had become convinced that his wife was conspiring with neighbors against him and had tried to imprison her in their home. Hospital records show that William Whitlock died in the asylum in 1902. Notes from the staff described a hereditary tendency toward paranoid ideation. The file also contained a letter from Thomas's mother, Sarah, written to the hospital director in 1895, expressing concern for her son's nervous temperament and asking whether his father's condition could be inherited. The director's response, also preserved, reassured her that mental illness was not necessarily hereditary, but advised that Thomas be steered toward work that avoided excessive stress or isolation, suggesting that even then, some predisposition was recognized. In October 1952, Professor Alan Matthews, a University of Missouri historian studying Ozark folklore, visited the Whitlock property at the invitation of its new owners. Matthews documented the layout of the homestead and the exact spot where Eliza's remains were found. In his notes, preserved in the university archives, he described the homestead's eerie isolation. The house sits in a narrow valley, surrounded on three sides by steep wooded slopes. Even at midday, parts of the yard are cast in shadow. Though the nearest neighbor is less than a mile away as the crow flies, the house is completely hidden from view. Matthews noted, "A person could scream here and not be heard beyond these hills." He also documented local folklore that had grown around the property since the Whitlock's departure. Residents claimed to avoid the area, saying that travelers sometimes heard a woman weeping with a sound of digging when passing the abandoned homestead at night. Matthews wrote in his field journal, "The acoustic properties of this valley are unusual. Standing at the site of the root cellar, I dropped stones into the remaining depression and noted how the sound echoed off the limestone bluffs. Even a small impact reverberates in the still air. It occurs to me that if someone had been digging here at night in 1911 or 1912, the sound might have traveled for a great distance, giving rise to these tales of ghostly activity." The case of Eliza Whitlock was officially closed in December 1952. Her death ruled a homicide attributed to Thomas Whitlock. Eliza was buried in Springfield Cemetery alongside her parents and sister. The story briefly made headlines in regional newspapers, but soon faded from public attention, overshadowed by larger national events. Today, the Tenney County Historical Society maintains a small file on the case, which includes copies of the original sheriff's reports, excerpts from Eliza's diary, and clippings from the 1952 rediscovery. Richard Anderson, who had served as a deputy sheriff under James Harmon in 1912, provided one of the final testimonies related to the case. In his late 70s at the time of the 1952 investigation, Anderson recalled that Sheriff Harmon had remained deeply troubled by the Whitlock case long after the official investigation was closed. According to Anderson, Harmon mentioned the case on several occasions over the years, once remarking that sometimes the law's limitations mean that justice must wait. Anderson believed Harmon had suspected foul play, but lacked the evidence and resources to pursue it further. The last significant development in the Whitlock case came in 1968, when Mary Coleman's eldest son, Robert, contacted the Tenney County Historical Society. His mother had recently passed away from cancer, and while sorting through her belongings, Robert discovered a collection of childhood drawings hidden in their attic. The drawings, created when Mary was between the ages of 5 and 8, depicted a recurring scene: a small female figure beneath what looked like floorboards or earth, with stick figures standing above her. One drawing, labeled in a child's handwriting, "Mama Sleeping," showed a man digging nearby. At the Historical Society's request, psychologist Dr. Eleanor Mitchell analyzed the drawings. In her written report, now part of the case file, Mitchell observed, "These drawings show multiple characteristics typical of children who have witnessed or experienced trauma, including repeated disturbing themes, heavy pressure applied when drawing the ground or floor, and figures placed in constrained or buried positions. The consistency across multiple drawings suggests that this was not mere fantasy but a persistent memory or preoccupation. Robert Coleman later visited the former Whitlock property, by then replaced with a hunting lodge. In a letter to the Historical Society following his visit, he wrote, "Standing on that ground, I felt a profound sorrow, not just for the grandmother I never knew, but for my mother who carried this truth inside her for her entire life. Some secrets refuse to remain buried, no matter how deep they lie." Robert described Mary as a loving but distant parent, someone who seemed to leave part of herself behind in that Ozark Valley. She never spoke of her childhood and grew visibly anxious whenever her children asked about her parents. "Now I understand why," Robert wrote. "She was protecting us from a truth she herself could not face, that her father, the man who raised her, murdered her mother and forced her into a lifetime of silence." The Whitlock case has since been cited by criminologists and historians as a haunting example of how isolation and cultural norms in rural communities once allowed domestic violence to escalate unchecked. In the early 20th century Ozarks, where farms were separated by rough terrain and neighbors rarely interfered, a woman like Eliza Whitlock had almost no means of escape once her husband's mental state deteriorated. Even when concerns were raised by the midwife Harriet Bowman, by the teacher Abigail Thornton, or by Eliza's sister Catherine Crawford, law enforcement lacked the resources and jurisdiction to intervene without clear evidence of crime. The principle that a man's home is his castle effectively shielded Thomas Whitlock from outside scrutiny. Professor Alan Matthews, writing in the Journal of Ozark Studies in 1954, argued that this combination of physical isolation and cultural reluctance to intervene created an environment where family violence could go undetected for years, sometimes forever. Psychologists have also studied the case for its insight into childhood trauma. Dr. Mitchell suggested that Mary Whitlock had developed a form of dissociation to survive her early experiences. Rather than face the unbearable reality of her father's actions, Mary appears to have split her memories into compartments, allowing her to function as an adult, but at the cost of fully integrating what she knew. Today, the former Whitlock property is part of a recreational area. Few visitors are aware of the dark history beneath their feet. The limestone bluffs still throw long shadows across the valley, and at dusk, when the wind passes through the hollow, some say it carries echoes of the past. Faint sounds that could be mistaken for a woman's distant voice, still calling from under the ground. The case of Eliza Whitlock remains disturbing not only because of the manner of her death, but because of the long silence that followed. The years in which murder lay buried in both earth and memory, waiting for the day when justice at last could be named. This tendency toward non-intervention created an environment where someone could effectively vanish with little questioning. The diary found in 1952 remains our clearest window into Eliza's experience during those final months. Her writing reveals growing fear as her husband's mental state deteriorated, a desperate concern for her children's safety, and a deepening sense of isolation from the outside world. The entries portray a woman who understood her danger but found herself trapped, not just by the remote geography of the Ozarks, but by social conventions that offered wives and mothers almost no protection. Perhaps most haunting is the legacy of silence that followed Eliza's death. Her children, especially Mary, seem to have buried their memories along with their mother. They built psychological walls that allowed them to survive, but kept them from confronting the truth. When Mary's drawings were discovered after her death, they revealed that some part of her had always known. The truth had found expression in her art, even though it remained unspoken in her life. Local historian Margaret Branson, who has studied the Whitlock case extensively, wrote in a 2012 Centennial article, "What happened in that isolated valley was not simply the murder of a woman by her mentally ill husband. It was a murder of truth itself." Thomas Whitlock buried his wife twice, first in the ground behind their home, and then in a narrative that erased her existence and replaced it with abandonment. The children, too young to fully understand but old enough to know something was terribly wrong, were forced to participate in this fiction, carrying the weight of an unacknowledged truth for the rest of their lives. The Whitlock case reminds us that the most profound horrors are not always found in moments of explosive violence, but in the slow erosion of safety, in the gradual transformation of home into prison, and in the terrible silence that falls when those who should protect us become our greatest threat. In the deep hollows of the Ozarks, where sound travels strangely and darkness comes early, Eliza Whitlock's story reminds us that the most dangerous monsters are not supernatural beings, but ordinary humans whose mind have turned against them and against those they once loved. For criminologists and forensic psychologists, the Whitlock tragedy has become a case study in how isolation magnifies mental illness, how cultural norms enable abuse, and how the truth, no matter how carefully buried, eventually finds its way to the surface. Decades after Eliza's remains were found, forensic psychiatry has developed tools that might have identified Thomas Whitlock's deteriorating mental state before it led to violence. Laws have changed to provide greater protection to victims, yet similar stories still unfold in isolated places where privacy can serve as a shield for the unthinkable. The limestone soil of the Ozarks eventually revealed what Thomas Whitlock tried to hide. But for 40 years, Eliza lay forgotten in an unmarked grave, her fate known only to the man who put her there, and perhaps to the children who carry that knowledge in their nightmares. In that silence lies the true horror of the Whitlock case, a silence that spoke volumes to those willing to listen. Dr. Samuel Hirsch, a forensic psychiatrist who reviewed the records for a 1960 article in the American Journal of Psychiatry, proposed that Thomas Whitlock likely suffered from what would now be classified as paranoid schizophrenia. Much like his father, Hirsch observed that Thomas's symptoms followed the classic pattern of the disorder. First subtle suspicion of neighbors, then escalating fears about the security of his home, and finally the delusional belief that his wife was contaminated or dangerous. What made the Whitlock case unusual, Hirsch argued, was the extended period during which Thomas maintained a facade of normality after murder. Most familicide cases end with the perpetrator's suicide or quick apprehension, Hirsch wrote. Whitlock's ability to create and sustain an alternative narrative, convincing neighbors that his wife had abandoned the family and functioning in society for nearly 2 decades, suggests a complex relationship between his delusions and his understanding of social norms. He knew enough to hide his actions and craft a plausible story, which means that some part of him recognized that what he'd done would be condemned by others. The children's psychological responses have drawn particular interest from researchers. Edward Whitlock's school records, recovered during the 1952 investigation, show a sharp decline in academic performance and increasing behavioral problems after his mother's disappearance. His teacher documented incidents that we would now identify as dissociative episodes, moments when Edward became unresponsive or seemed to hear sounds that no one else could. These symptoms suggest that he may have suffered from what modern clinicians would diagnose as post-traumatic stress disorder. Mary Whitlock's response differed from her brother's. While Edward displayed outward signs of distress, Mary appeared to adapt more easily to their changed circumstances. Dr. Mitchell proposed that Mary's very young age at the time, 3 or 4 years old, made it easier for her to accept her father's version of events. Children of that age are still forming their understanding of permanence and causality, Mitchell wrote. Mary may have been more willing to believe her father's narrative because her cognitive framework was not fully developed. Yet, as her drawings reveal, the truth lived on in her unconscious mind, surfacing in her artwork in ways she cannot speak aloud. The long-term effects of this childhood trauma are still the subject of study today. Mary's adult life further evidenced the deep psychological scars left by her childhood. According to her husband's statements to investigators, she exhibited several traits common to adult survivors of early trauma: chronic anxiety, specific phobias connected to the original event, particularly an intense fear of enclosed spaces, an aversion to digging sounds, and a noticeable emotional detachment. Richard Coleman described his wife as loving but somehow absent, as if a part of her remained forever elsewhere. This splitting of consciousness, the ability to live a seemingly normal life while walling off traumatic memories, is a recognized survival mechanism in trauma psychology. The intergenerational effects of the trauma were suggested by their son, Robert Coleman, In his correspondence with the Historical Society, he wrote that Mary had been an intensely protective parent, sometimes to the point of conflict with his father. She would become irrationally anxious if we were out of her sight for even short periods, he recalled. And she had strict rules about certain activities. We were never allowed to play in the basement or to dig holes in the yard beyond a certain depth. At the time, these seemed arbitrary, but now I understand they were connected to her own buried experiences. The community's response to Eliza's disappearance reflects broader social patterns surrounding family violence and mental illness in early 20th century rural America. When Sheriff Harmon investigated the case in 1912, he was working within a legal and cultural framework that placed enormous value on family privacy and male authority. Domestic violence was widely regarded as a private matter rather than a crime requiring public intervention. Without clear evidence of foul play, and with Thomas Whitlock presenting a calm, plausible explanation for his wife's absence, Harmon had little legal ground to continue the investigation, no matter what his personal suspicions may have been. Similarly, neighbors who noticed Thomas's increasingly erratic behavior, his isolation, the unusual modifications to his property, his agitated demeanor in town, interpret these signs through the understanding of their time. Mental illness was poorly understood and often stigmatized, seen as a moral failing or spiritual weakness rather than a medical condition requiring treatment. The withdrawal of a family from community life might have raised eyebrows, but was not considered justification for intervention, especially in the Ozarks, where independence and self-sufficiency were deeply held cultural values. Even those closest to the situation faced significant barriers. Catherine Crawford, Eliza's sister, had no legal standing to demand access to her niece and nephew or to compel a more thorough investigation. In her journal, she wrote in frustration, "If Eliza were merely property gone missing, the law would take greater interest, but a woman who might have chosen to leave, that is considered her right, no matter how uncharacteristic such an action would be." Criminologist Dr. Lane Foster, in her 1980 study of rural homicide patterns, included the Whitlock case as a prime example of what she termed invisible crimes. These were acts of violence that went undiscovered due to geographic isolation and cultural factors. In urban settings, Foster wrote, disappearances are more likely to be noticed and questioned. Multiple social connections create a network that makes complete erasure difficult. But in regions like the Ozarks in the early 20th century, a person could effectively vanish with minimal disruption, particularly a woman whose social identity was tied almost entirely to her husband. Foster argued that the 4-decade delay in discovering Eliza's fate was not simply the result of investigative failure, but a symptom of systemic blindness to certain forms of violence. The story Thomas Whitlock told, that his wife had abandoned her family, was readily accepted because it fit a familiar narrative about women leaving home under the strain of frontier life. The alternative explanation, that a husband had murdered his wife, was more disturbing and far harder to address legally or socially. For the community, it was easier to accept abandonment. The physical environment of the Ozarks also played a key role in the concealment of the crime. The rugged terrain, with its deep hollows, dense forests, and limestone caves, provided natural hiding places. As historians have noted, the same conditions that later made the Ozarks ideal for Prohibition-era moonshining also made them a perfect setting for a crime to go unseen. The Whitlock homestead sat in a narrow valley, surrounded by steep hillsides, virtually ensuring that unusual activities would go unnoticed. The brutal winter of 1911 to 1912, with its heavy snowfall and freezing temperatures, further reduced the chance of unexpected visitors who might have seen something suspicious. Professor Matthews, in his later study of property, pointed out that the limestone-rich soil played an unexpected role in preserving crucial evidence. The alkaline soil and relatively dry conditions inside the collapsed root cellar helped preserve both the diary and, to some extent, Eliza's remains. In more acidic soil or wetter climates, decomposition would have been far more complete, potentially erasing any chance of identification decades later. This accidental preservation allowed the truth to eventually come to light. When Walter and Ruth Simmons discovered Eliza's diary in 1952, they provided the key that finally unlocked the mystery and set in motion an investigation that revealed what had happened on that isolated homestead 40 years earlier.